What's going on, YouTube? I'm back with another video today talking about something that a lot of golf coaches have been talking about lately, which is hip slide at impact. Let's discuss. All right, today we get to discuss one of my biggest pet peeves that coaches talk about, which is hip slide. They say that you need hip slide with your driver a lot more than you do with your irons, and they encourage golfers to have hip slide. Well, here's the thing. Yes, your hips do slide more with the driver than they do with an iron, but we really need to narrow down what that actual movement is and stop talking about hip slides. Get that out of your vocabulary so that you can do it correctly and implement it in your swing to have more power, which is not a hip slide. Let's do this. All right, let's start by looking at an iron swing here and how much your hips actually slide when you're actually hitting a golf ball. So, to sum it up, hip slide is essentially the lateral movement of your hips in one direction or another. Now, hip slide going laterally on your backswing is considered a sway. So we don't want that. We want to shift off the golf ball and actually load your trail side. That's what I always talk about. If I just said that your hips move laterally, we'd be in a big problem. So with irons, and we're talking about technically lateral movement here, not just hip sliding, what happens is on your golf swing when you go back, your hips do have to slide forward slightly to get back to that golf ball. Now, with irons, it's very minimal. So you can see in that one, if we set up a line here and a line here, when I'm actually swinging this club at setup, you can see that on my downswing, I start sliding a little bit more forward into impact. What this is essentially just your hips shifting forward and then rotating. So now let's bring it to driver and see a little bit of the differences there. So with driver, since the ball is A, up on a tee, and B, way more in front of your stance, you're obviously going to have more lateral hip movement to get back to that golf ball to actually hit it. If your hips stayed in the exact same spot, it would be very difficult to actually get that ball. So if your hips stay in the same spot and we're trying to hit this ball, it's tough to get there. And I know I just swung all arms. It's just an example. So technically speaking, your hips do slide in your downswing so that you can get to that front ball position and hit that golf ball. I'll show an example. Okay, so now we have a basic understanding of what hip sliding actually is, and yes, it does occur in your swing. But we need to eliminate hip slide from your vocabulary, because if you do actually just focus on sliding your hips, you're essentially going to slide into a soft left side, and you're going to just turn like this versus focusing on a powerful rotation. So a lot of people that focus on hip slide will actually lose speed. A lot of times will slide under that golf ball and will not be able to post up on their right side and actually generate a lot of power. So we need to take it back and show you exactly how you should have hip slide, which really we're going to start calling lateral hip movement. So lateral hip movement occurs for two reasons that are really important in your swing. The first is that you actually load onto your front side. So once you get onto your backside, you've loaded your trail side properly, that shift of weight to your front side is lateral hip motion. It's not your hips shifting forward, because this move and shifting weight there, your hips do move laterally, but that's very different than this move right here. If you can see the difference that's going to lead to power, one, I'm actually loading into that front side and being strong and ready to rotate and explode. The other, I'm just softly moving my hips back and forth. We don't want your hips just to move aimlessly back and forth to have hip shift. We want you to aggressively get to the top, load your front side, which moves your hips laterally so that you can then explode. The second aspect of this is actually your trail glute firing and this left hip clearing. Your trail glute and your right hip are going to fire a little bit more aggressively to create that rotation, then your left hip can just clear back. If your left leg completely flew off the ground like this, yes, that would then theoretically clear more than your right glute would clear forward. But in the golf swing, your right glute is firing this way, your hip is clearing this way, and your left hip is just getting out of the way for this to rotate forward. So you can see in a bunch of different professional swings, let's just take Scotty for instance, you can see that his right side definitely clears more than his left side. While his left side does clear back slightly, it's not clearing back as much as that right side is going forward. What happens with this is, since your right side is moving forward so much, your left side is moving back slightly. Well, this is causing a hip shift. It's really creating lateral movement this way with your hips, because overall your hips are moving forward, but it's because they're rotating, the left side just not rotating backwards as much as the right side is rotating forwards. There are tons of golf coaches out there that teach you to present your hips forward to compensate for this lateral shift of your hips, or hip shift. So we need to make sure that you are not doing that, first of all, because what happens is, if you set up to the ball, while yes, you want your hips to be around here going into impact, it's really as a byproduct of this being more forward and you shifting your weight, just like I said, for those two reasons. It's not just aimlessly cocking your hips forward. You're essentially putting yourself into a forward sway, versus on a backswing, we talk about your hip coming out too far this way, which is a back sway. When you're in this position, this actually ends up creating a sway this way. We'll talk about that in a second. But if you just set up at the golf ball with your hips aimlessly forward, now you're in a position to really not load your trail side properly. Everything just kind of goes out of whack because you're just cocking your hips forward. I think this is one of the worst moves possible that you can do at impact. If anything, just create a different spine angle of bringing your spine backwards a little bit. Create a little bit more angle in your spine versus being upright. This will help you stay behind your ball and will encourage your hips to be more out in front of your spine angle without actually just preloading your hips one way. So going back to this sway, if you're swaying on this side, what that's going to encourage is you to sway on your downswing, which is turning into a not hard side and doing that hip shift. The negative hip shift. It's getting into your backside this way, and then you can't get onto your front side because you have to move so far laterally with your hips this way to even get back to your front side. By that time, you're not rotating, everything's just moving this way. That is what a ton of golfers do when they're trying to implement more power with their lower body. They end up shifting this way, getting into a sway versus just shifting and rotating and turning. Once they're in that sway position, they can't get back to their front side. When they can't get back to their front side, then they can't rotate forcefully to actually get the pelvis to move properly, so they end up just getting that hip shift forward versus a lateral hip movement with power. Talked about in the previous video, your hips actually working upward, that pelvis working upward. It's the same thing, it works forward and upward at the same time, and that's that real glute firing with this left hip clearing. That's the proper motion in your swing, and it all starts with making sure you have a proper load in your backside, a proper shift of weight, which then encourages that lateral shift, but in a good way, to then forcefully rotate through the golf ball. So in summary, we don't want to encourage you to do a hip slide. We do want you to have lateral hip movement, but that's going to be a byproduct of a proper load on the trail side, a proper shift of weight to your front side, and proper rotation through the swing. Naturally, you will have that lateral hip movement to get back to the ball, but anything on the hip slide front, and you're trying to get encouraged to have more hip slide or focusing on that hip slide, you're just going to go down a rabbit hole that's not going to be good for your golf swing. It's going to likely lead to a lower angle of attack because you're going to end up sliding through that golf ball. You're going to chunk a lot of drivers. You're going to sky them because you're going to go straight under them. Probably going to end up breaking a lot of drivers because you can go under the ball. Ball's going to hit the top of your crown and it's going to end up shattering. So we need to really, really, really focus on proper loading the trail side, proper shifting of weight, and then proper rotation. Through that, you will have a lateral hip movement as a byproduct of all those pieces, but you never again need to focus on actually having hip slide. That is it for today. I hope this video helps to clarify a few things that a lot of coaches talk about, but may not talk about in the correct form. We're all roughly trying to say the same thing, but again, this is a byproduct of other things happening in your swing. Focus on those other pieces, and these little pieces, like your hip movement, will become very clear on what it's supposed to look like without even thinking about it at all. Let me know in the comments down below if you have any questions on this topic and how your hips are supposed to move throughout your swing. And until next time, we'll see you guys later.